Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to today's session. Good morning, good evening from my side of the world. I know a few sisters are trying to join us, so they'll be eventually joining us in some time. But we would like to begin with an invocation. Um, I request Sister Hortensia to kindly please lead us with her prayer.
Gracias, Joy.
Yes, thank you, Joy. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. Once more, we are so thankful to life for allowing us to get together and begin one more week of activities in a virtual way. This is our last session in the month of February. So we want to thank life itself for the fact that we are here and we are well. And as our ancestors have taught us, we're going to be thankful for our day. And the meaning of the day today in Maya is ahun, which means assertiveness. It is the element of today is water that brings us strength today. And each one of us today communicates with the universe and the higher energies in different ways. And so we can connect in those ways. And what I will do is to do so in ways that I have learned. I thank the creator for life. I am grateful for each one of the participants, each guest. Thank you for the life of the interpreters. Thank you for the whole FEME team that's making it possible for this process of connecting to happen. We're also grateful for the lives of each participant. We know that being in a process like this is not really easy. Having access to internet can be a problem, health issues, other things, but you are here. And we are grateful to the spirit of waters that cleanses our minds and hearts. And when we feel tired, when we feel the need to sit down and just have a glass of water, it gives us what we need to continue. We're beginning another week of activities. This is an opportunity for us, for those of us who are in this process, to feel a bit of hope and hope that others will have this opportunity someday as well. We want to be a channel of communication to others. We want to be able to take information to others, and that's why we're here. We want to see this opportunity to be trained and to learn about other experiences and to exchange experiences as something that is precious. And we are grateful for the experts who are sharing with us. We pray for the health of each participant. We know that changing our schedules up every day is difficult, but because of the responsibility and conviction that we each have, we pray for the strength to continue and to strengthen the love we have for what we're doing. We are grateful once, twice, and 3 times for being here. We ask for wisdom for our guests who are going to be with us. Thank you to our grandmothers and grandfathers. We ask for your accompaniment this morning, this afternoon, and this evening. Thank you once, twice, and 3 times. May everything go well today.
Thank you, Sister Orte, for opening the day for us. For today's session, we have a very special guest, Brother Dego. Welcome, Brother. Brother Dego has always been a part of our sessions, and we're really glad to have him back this year as well. So just to introduce Dego, Dego Titiwana is a Quechua Otavalo from Ecuador. He is a diplomat of the Ecuadorian Foreign Service, and he has multiple experience in human rights, disarmament, and migration issues. He is currently serving as Deputy Chief of Mission at the Ecuador Embassy in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, and from 2020 to 2022 in his capacity as head of the technical office of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the province of Imbabura. He oversaw human mobility and foreign policy issues in the northern border area. In 2014, Diego became the first indigenous career diplomat that was appointed at the permanent mission to the United Nations. From 2014 to 2019, he was the facilitator of the United Nations resolution on the rights of indigenous peoples. Under his leadership, the United Nations started two important actions for the indigenous people. One is the process of enhancing their participation at the United Nations, and second, the proclamation of 2019 as the International Year of Indigenous Languages. Dago is a 2019 Yale Greenberg World Fellow and 2021 Draper Hills Summer Fellow from Stanford University. He holds a master's degree in international relations and diplomacy and has a BA in international relations. In addition to this, he is also a PhD candidate in advanced studies in human rights at the University of Carlos III de Madrid. Brother Diego will be speaking to us about the United Nations Permanent Forum and how it works, its mandate for today's session. We're really glad to have him. Welcome, Brother Diego, and over to you.
Muchas gracias. Good morning, Joy. Good morning.
Thank you.
Sister, buenos días, Joy. Buenos días, hermanos y hermanas. Querida Hortensia, qué grato volver.
Good morning to all of you. It's good to see all of you again. Dear Hortensia, how wonderful to see you. And once again, it is an honor for me to come back to this space. I have been invited to some of these training activities, and it's one of the favorite things that I do to be able to share with my Indigenous sisters. And so we're sending you so much affection in this important time. Greetings to Sister Teresa as well. And we're going to begin today with the training that they've asked me to do. Maybe we can confirm whether I can share screen right now. I think I can. Perfect. I will do so shortly.
Creo que ahí se visibiliza.
I think you can see it now. Is that right? All right. Thanks for confirming. So I will try to speak a bit slowly since we have interpreters. If you can confirm that the interpretation into English is working.
Yes.
Great. Okay. I am not going to concentrate specifically about the permanent forum. Rather, I'm going to try to talk about all of the mechanisms of the United Nations that have to do with Indigenous peoples in this space. Why? Because in this way, we will be able to understand what the permanent forum does and what the various other entities do. For example, the rapporteurship for Indigenous peoples and other intergovernmental spaces that exist, which are the spaces, in fact, where decisions are made, as well as expert mechanisms. And so I want my sisters to understand better of how the various mechanisms of the United Nations work outside the permanent forum. And to do that, let's highlight a few aspects. In first place, Indigenous people have been looking for a recognition of our identity, ways of life, and rights to land, territory, and natural resources that we've had traditionally for years. And this is something we have to highlight. Also, our focus in doing this is not only aimed at the United Nations. The Indigenous peoples have been searching for this recognition at the United Nations. And one of the great leaders in 1923, when the UN was created, tried to go and speak to this international organization of that moment, which was called the League of Nations at the time. His name was Desgaje. He was a indigenous chief, and he wanted to have indigenous presence recognized and to be able to defend territories. He was not permitted to speak, but in 1925, another Maori religious leader, T.W. Ratana, also approached these spaces to try to speak. So both Desgaje and Ratana were actually denied access to this UN mechanism, this international mechanism, which was called the League of Nations at the time. Indigenous peoples, in reality, Joy mentioned it, and I'm also part of the Quechua o Tuvalu people, and we've been among the most disadvantaged groups in the world. And this is true all over the world, Indigenous peoples. And the international community has finally recognized that it's important to adopt special measures to protect indigenous peoples. So what we're going to talk about now is the organogram of the United Nations. If you can see here, it's extremely large. And what do we have first in the UN? We have the primary bodies. General Assembly of the United Nations is the main democratic space for this system. And 193 member states are represented here, each one with one vote. Then we have the Security Council, which is only made up of 15 states. 5 of them are permanent, and there are other 10 that are rotating. And then we have the Economic Social Council, which is made up also of a certain number of member states who are nominated. And then after there are elections held for who's going to be part of the Economic and Social Council. We have the Secretariat of the United Nations, which is led by the Secretary General. And we have the International Court of Justice and the Council of Trustees. The Council of Trustees is the only one of these 6 bodies that is no longer functioning because their mandate was not being fulfilled. However, the other entities are alive because they're part of the original charter of the United Nations. And the charter, from the creation of the UN itself, has not been modified since the very beginning. So you see the name of the Council of Trustees inside the organizational chart of the United Nations, even though it's no longer functioning. And if you're able to visit the UN at some point, I'm not sure that if this year, if you're going to be able to participate in FEMI in person in the permanent forum. Oh, not yet. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, I remember that the Global School of Leadership always happened specifically when different sisters from all over the world were going to the United Nations anyway. So I was able to meet some of your predecessors and your previous directors. So when you're able to visit the UN, you'll see that there's special rooms. There's the main room where the General Assembly of the UN meets. There's a particular meeting room for the Economic and Social Council. And there's also a special meeting space for the Security Council. And the room originally designated for the trustees is there, but it's being used for other activities. And this is important just to visualize it. Now, within each of the main bodies, there are subsidiary groups, there are organic commissions, there are offices, a lot of different entities in which a lot of different topics of importance around the world are analyzed. And in all of these different spaces, you have different committees and programs and funds and departments, etc. And within all of this, we can see which are the mechanisms that are important to us, as well as to think about the fact that these are some of the main spaces where Indigenous peoples' topics are being worked on. So if we go back to the General Assembly for a minute, you can see the different committees of the General Assembly. Inside the General Assembly, and we can see this more in a more detailed way at the end of our presentation, there are primary UN bodies. There are 6 main committees. The first committee looks at issues of disarmament and national security. The second deals with economic subjects, and you also see climate change being addressed here, as well as sustainable development. The third commission or committee is the committee that covers human rights, social topics, cultural topics. But there, in that commission, you present the resolutions on the rights of Indigenous peoples. As Joy mentioned, I had the privilege and the responsibility of facilitating that resolution on the rights of Indigenous peoples, which is presented in this third commission. So it's negotiated within the third committee, and then it's adopted by the General Assembly more formally, and that activates a lot of processes. And I can explain that to you in a little bit, but I want you to kind of get a sense of the structure and where each of these approaches come from. So for me, the main space where decisions are made that allow progress on discussions about Indigenous peoples in the United Nations is here, and that is something that really allows things to become operational. Now, I also want to talk about the Human Rights Council, because even though it meets and has its headquarters in Geneva, it is a subsidiary body of the United Nations. So we need to understand that we have the General Assembly, we have the Human Rights Council, and within the Human Rights Council, we have the expert mechanisms on the Indigenous peoples, and that's where you have the special rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples. And so that's part of this machinery here of the General Assembly. And And here with the arrow, you can see there's the permanent forum for Indigenous affairs. And it's there because at the beginning, when when the permanent forum was created, it was created as a subsidiary organization of the Economic and Social Council. You can see there's different commissions here. There's a social development committee, there's statistics, forestry, population and development. We have something called UNITAR. We have the Commission on Refugees. There's many, many different kinds of spaces and entities within the United Nations that look at all of the different issues in the world. And within those, we have three particular spaces where the mechanisms on the rights of Indigenous peoples are housed. So a few years ago, we also started to reactivate FIDA and FAO, which have particular relevance and some conversations that are taking place within our spaces. And after 2019 and currently, now that we are in the framework of the celebration of the Decade of Indigenous Languages, and I say celebration because that's the translation of what we say when something is happening, the national year or the national or the international decade. It basically says that we are doing it. Sometimes we talk about the celebration, and some people thought, why are we celebrating? But we're not talking about that when we say the celebration of the decade. We're talking about the development and all the work that goes into having an international decade of Indigenous languages.
I think that with this, perhaps you can see a little bit better how they're housed. And now I'm going to talk about what they are. So here you'll see the title, United Nations and Indigenous People. So I had said we have the Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues. Then we have the expert mechanisms on the rights of Indigenous peoples. Then we have the special rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples, but then we also have the intergovernmental processes. So why do I separate this from the rest? And why we have the other mechanisms, the other three separate? Why do I separate them? The difference is basically because the Permanent Forum for the Indigenous Peoples, the expert mechanisms for the rights of Indigenous people, and the special rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples, those that are in these spaces, the experts in these spaces are independent experts. They are completely independent experts because there's no interaction in terms of status, in terms of negotiations with the states. The states do participate in the meetings. They work, the states work and grant or invite the special rapporteur to visit their countries. But when I talk about intergovernmental spaces, that's the space where the governments discuss different issues and come to agreements. The states, both in the Permanent Forum for Indigenous Peoples and at the expert mechanisms, they are only observers. They don't participate. The reports that come from the Permanent Forum or from MRIP and the reports from the special rapporteur don't have they don't come with any negotiations with the states. I don't know if I'm making myself clear. I don't know if I'm explaining myself, but I also wanted to let you know that if you have any questions during the presentation, you can raise your hand and I can clarify some things, or I can do that at the end, where I would like to have actually a space for questions and answers towards the end. But if through the process, if you think anything needs clarification, do let me know. Sometimes, as you know the subject really well, you may not add enough information or clarify things well enough. Because look, when I arrived in New York in 2014, everything was really confusing. All of this was such a complex area. I was a diplomatic delegate. I would go to the meetings. When I went to the permanent forum meetings, I didn't really understand at the beginning. So I kind of like self-educated myself, and participating at the meetings is how I really came to understand it well. So at the beginning, it's complicated, so don't worry too much. It'll happen for you too, but I am happy to clarify anything as you go through the process if you need to. Okay, next then, what is the Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues? What is that? It is a subsidiary body of ECOSOC that advises ECOSOC on Indigenous peoples' issues. It was created in the year 2000, and it came after many, many years of struggle. You can imagine that in 2007, just recently, we had the approval of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That is that was after more than 30 years of negotiations and struggles and work. And the Permanent Forum is part of those international initiatives and that declaration after many years and work by Indigenous peoples that was carried out at the United Nations. And they saw that it was really important to have a space to discuss Indigenous peoples' issues. It continues having the same name as the same name that it had when it was created, the Permanent Forum for Indigenous Peoples. Lately, we've been talking about why add the word issues, Indigenous peoples' issues, or just have a permanent forum for Indigenous peoples and remove the word issues. But for that, there would have to be a negotiation process and make changes at a very formal level. But let me make a connection here. The resolution that allowed the creation of the Permanent Forum for the Indigenous Peoples comes from a work done at the ECOSOC by the members of ECOSOC. They negotiated this resolution, and that's what allowed the existence of a permanent forum for Indigenous peoples' issues. Once it was created, the states are no longer part of the negotiation of the reports that are sent after a two-week meeting. But it comes instead from the negotiations done by the issues that are considered crucial by its members. Sometimes people think that the Permanent Forum is this space for meetings, open, and that is the main space where the majority of people from the indigenous peoples come to the UN. But the Permanent Forum is not a meeting space. You may have seen the ECOSOC room. There's a fiduciary fund room. So that is not a space. Sometimes they meet at the conference room 4. So the forum is not a physical space. The forum is made up by 16 members. And as I said, it's an advising body to ECOSOC and it talks specifically about economic and social development, culture, environment, education, health, and human rights. All right. This is good to have all of these different areas because it's broad and allows flexibility to the secretary and the permanent forum members. Usually, every year except for the fourth year, we set topics for each one of the permanent forum sessions. These topics are taken from one of these areas. So the topic is analyzed according to the economic and social development or culture and environment. This session, for example, is much more related to the environment. Other years is more related perhaps to education, other years with health, and so on and so forth. A few years ago, we still had virtual sessions. We included COVID. So these 6 areas give us flexibility to choose topics for the members to choose the topics that they're going to discuss the following year. Moreover, the permanent forum, through its structure, also advises gets socialized advice and formulates recommendations on Indigenous issues beyond the council. It also gets advice to other UN bodies, but through ECOSOC. Likewise, it creates more knowledge and awareness and coordination of activities related to Indigenous issues within the UN system. All of these spaces, and it's good that you also go to the Permanent Forum webpage, because you're going to see there all of the information from the beginning, from its first session. Everything's recorded there, all the work that is being done within the Permanent Forum. But as I was saying, we have to understand who they are. So the Permanent Forum, again, is not a space. Perhaps, or maybe it was just me, I had that impression that a forum is usually a space, more like perhaps a physical space for instruction. But the permanent forum is made up by 16 members. So it's a body of people. These members are selected the following way. 8 are nominated by the government, okay? So 8 of those members, and they're the first to be designated that way. They are nominated by the states, by the governments, and then they're elected at this level. To be a little bit more clear, I'm going to take the example of Guatemala with Hortensia, for example. If Hortensia were to be nominated by the Guatemalan government to be a permanent forum member, she would be part of the 8 members nominated by the governments. Hortensia then receives the support of the Guatemalan government to be part of the permanent forum. But from these 8 spaces, then they're divided so that each space, so that it is distributed there, the spaces are distributed within the sociocultural regions that exist, or the 7 different sociocultural regions recognized by the UN. So every 3 years for Latin America, sometimes there are 2 spaces or 1 space. But I guess 1 position. We have 1 for North America, 1 for Latin America, etc. they're divided according to the regions that way.
Pero
But
en los estados, la manera en la que ¿cómo les podría explicar? Eh,
the
¿Cómo está
way
dividida Naciones Unidas, sus 193
how
miembros?
is
¿Cómo
UN
divide
divided? How is the UN
las
divided
distintas candidaturas que
in
existen,
terms of the different
los diferentes
candidacies
mecanismos
that
que
exist
tienen
for
los
the
órganos subsidiarios,
different
comisiones?
mechanisms or subsidiary bodies
Actualmente
or
están divididos
committees?
por 5 regiones.
There are only
Existen
5
5
regions. So
Entonces,
there are
desde
5
antes, bueno,
regions.
ahí esto puede causar confusión.
So maybe I wasn't very
Vamos a ver,
clear.
vamos a tratar
Don't
de
worry if
explicarlo.
it's a little bit
Los
confusing.
indígenas,
Indigenous
existe reconocimiento dentro de
there
cada
is a
región
for
de
the
7
indigenous
regiones.
peoples, there's a recognition of, so the UN
Pero
recognizes 7 regions in
normalmente,
terms of indigenous
cuando
peoples.
los estados
But
están
usually when
negociando, están
the governments are negotiating,
buscando espacios, por ejemplo, para
looking
sus
for
miembros del Consejo de Derechos
spaces,
Humanos, para
for
su Consejo
example,
del
for the
Consejo de
Human
Seguridad,
Rights
para ser miembros del
Council,
ECOSOC,
for Security
para
Council, for ECOSOC,
formar parte de una comisión de desarrollo
to be
social,
part
para
of
formar parte de la
a
condición
social
social y jurídica de la. Todas
committee
estas nominaciones que existen
for
de personas
the Commission on the Status of Women.
para formar
For
parte de estos
this,
espacios lo hacen a través de las 5 regiones.
they divide
Entonces, cuando
this
se
through
refiere
the
a los
5
16
regions.
los
So when we talk about the
miembros que
16
son
members,
nominados por los estados
there are 8
se rigen
nominated by the governments,
en el marco de los
and
5
those have to
de
conform
los
to the
5
positions
de estas divisiones
opened
según
up
región.
through
¿Ya?
these
Esto
5
significa que a
regions.
veces
So that's why I say
Latinoamérica, que a
sometimes
veces
it's Latin
países
America,
de
sometimes
Norteamérica
countries from North
les
America
corresponde
may have
2 países, ¿no? 2 espacios, perdón.
2
Entonces,
positions
cada
per
3
region.
años
So every 3
existe
years,
esta rotación de 2 espacios dentro del foro permanente.
there's a rotation
Beneficia
for
a
those
todas
every
las
two
regiones,
for
a todas
those
estas regiones,
2
¿no?
spaces.
Entonces, a veces es
So
Latinoamérica,
they rotate
a veces
basically.
es
Sometimes Latin
Norteamérica,
America has 2 spaces.
a veces
Sometimes
puede
it
ser
is North America that has 2
son
spaces.
países o
Sometimes
expertos que son nominados por parte de la región africana. Entonces,
there may
desde
be
ese
2
factor mayor,
spaces, 2 experts for the African region. They rotate.
número de
So
representación existe, esta se divide. ¿Por qué todo
that's how
esto?
it's divided up.
¿Por qué les explico esto?
So that's
Y
why do I
retomando
explain
a
this?
lo que
Why do I give this
una
detail?
de
Why
las
why
sesiones
do I give these this
para
example of perhaps
permanente.
nominating Hortensia for the
Porque si
permanent
ella
forum?
llega
Because if
a ser
Hortensia
nominada por
is
su
nominated
gobierno
by her
y en
government,
ese periodo de sesiones,
and during that
digamos,
period of
2023,
sessions, let's say
bueno, que el año que sigue,
2023,
2023,
it's
2024,
they last their term is 3 years. So
existe solo
until
un espacio para
2026. Let's say that there's
Latinoamérica,
only one space for
pero
Latin America,
también decidió el
but
gobierno del Ecuador
the
nominar a
Ecuadorian
Diego
government
Tituán.
also decided to
Pero
nominate
además
Diego
de
Tituaña.
el gobierno
And then the government
de Argentina
of
decide
Argentina
nominar a
decides
X
to
persona.
nominate
Hay
X
3, 4 espacios,
person.
4 nominados.
So there are 3 or 4 nominated
¿Ya?
people by the region,
Pero hay solo un espacio.
but there's only one
Solo hay un
space.
espacio. ¿Qué es lo que sucede?
So what happens?
Existe votación dentro de los miembros
There
del ECOSOC
is a vote
para
within
escoger
the ECOSOC
al
members
nominado
to choose the one
de la región de Latinoamérica.
from all
¿Ya?
those nominated that will
De
serve
manera similar
for
para
the
todos
Latin
los
American
demás. Voy a
position.
darles un
Same way
ejemplo.
for the rest of the regions. That was just an
Hortensia,
example. Then Hortensia,
bueno, vamos a hablar para dar ejemplos, ¿no? Con nombres.
just again,
Hortensia
using an
del
example with
gobierno
names. So
de
Hortensia
Guatemala,
nominated
gobierno
by the
nomina el
Guatemalan
Consejo.
government, Diego
Entonces,
Tituaña by the Ecuadorian
Tarsila
government, and
nominada por el
Tarsila nominated by
Perú. Entonces existen
Peru.
3
So there are
candidatos
3
para un
candidates for just one position.
Entonces los gobiernos de cada
So
país
the
también
governments from
trabajan,
the
negocian
countries
candidaturas de
work,
intercambio.
negotiate,
Entonces dicen, bueno,
exchange
miren, nosotros tenemos un
candidacies.
candidato
They
para
may say, look,
foro
we have a
permanente, nos podemos
candidate for the permanent
y
forum.
ahí México dice, bueno,
And
nosotros
perhaps
tenemos un
Mexico says,
interés en un
well,
candidato para
we're
el foro
interested and having a candidate
eh,
for
dentro de la Comisión de Desarrollo Social.
the
Entonces, ellos
Social
intercambian
Development
votaciones
Commission, for example. So they
por
can
unos
exchange
grupos
votes. They
de
negotiate
personas
that
que
way.
deciden
Some countries
apoyar a un
decide
candidato.
unilaterally to
Eso
support
ya
a
tiene un
specific
trabajo, un
candidate.
equipo de
That's also work
190
by
personas que tienen
a team
todos los países, 293 países.
that all countries have. All 193 countries have a team for that, and they negotiate. Then the moment of the vote comes, voting happens, and the one who has the most votes wins. So Hortensia may have 16, 18 votes, Diego 5, Tarsila has 8. So the one with the highest number of votes from the ECOSOC members keeps that position. There have been cases, and when I was in New York, I saw this. There were complex votes where one or two votes decided that a member would become the member. And in other cases, the governments came to an agreement. They said, since there's only one space, Peru decided to withdraw their nomination. Ecuador may also withdraw its nomination. And then only one remains for the space available. So that is how the 8 members nominated by the governments come to be part of the permanent forum. But then we have another 8 members, right? These 8 members come nominated by the indigenous peoples organizations. So what happens? The secretariat, the permanent forum secretariat, once the vacancies are open, because every time that one of the terms ends, they spread the word, sometimes through their contacts with indigenous peoples organizations, but it is public. So through their webpage, that information is available as well once the term is open. And there's an invitation for the indigenous peoples organizations to nominate their representatives to be members of the permanent forum of indigenous peoples issues. So the members, the different indigenous peoples organization have a specific amount of time to send their nominations. And then there is a nomination process. And at the end, the president of ECOSOC is the one who elects. By then, okay, there is a call, an open call first. There's an initial filter, I believe, from the permanent forum secretary and its area of social development body. So there's an initial screening of the candidates. Then there's an internal process inside the UN that ends up receiving the final nomination by the ECOSOC president. This happens once you have the 8 members nominated by the state, so it's secondary to the other process. The 16 members of the permanent forum try to be conformed of regional diversity and gender diversity. What do I mean? If there are 8 members, so if by chance the 8 members that have been selected for these positions by the government are men, then it's quite likely or at least it would be considered
los otros miembros
that the other 8
se les
members,
dé una prioridad a las candidatas mujeres.
for the other 8 members, women are given priority.
Existen, miren, ahí el mismo espacio
So
para
look,
Latinoamérica,
for Latin America again,
existe
and for the other regions, there is a number
de representantes
that
por los estados como por
corresponds to the
organizaciones de
states
Entonces,
and indigenous peoples organizations.
Hortensia ya es
So if
miembro
Hortensia
del foro permanente
is
de los
already
gobiernos.
a
También va a haber
permanent forum member on the side of the government,
los,
but
de las
there could
organizaciones
also be 1 or 2 that are also nominated by indigenous peoples organizations.
o hay un espacio. Entonces, ¿qué es lo que
And
hace?
maybe there's 1 space. So what is it going to do?
Hortensia
Hortensia
de Guatemala. Entonces,
comes from Guatemala. So
es muy improbable
it is unlikely
un candidato o una
that
candidata que
a
proviene
candidate from Guatemala
que una organización indígena de Guatemala la
or a candidate that has been nominated by an indigenous peoples organization from Guatemala be elected. Why? Because there's already a member from Guatemala on the government side. So it's unlikely they choose another member from Guatemala for the indigenous peoples organizations. So that is how all of those conversations have to happen at the time the nominations are made. So these are all factors that come into play. I'd like to highlight something here, and this is personal ability. So, regardless where the members come from, in terms of whether they are from a government nomination or indigenous people organizations nominations, they have to have that person. It's an issue of personal ability. So Hortensia, for example, is designated by the government. She's going to work to strengthen policies or improve situations for the government of Guatemala because the government nominated her. So both the governments and those nominated understand that once they are in the permanent forum, they act in their personal capacity. And the same happens to the other 8 members by the indigenous peoples organizations. So one may say, we nominated X member and they're not really following the guidelines that the organization or government that nominated this person gave this person. They can come to the forum with those questions. However, there's nothing that can be done at that point because once they come to the permanent forum, they work independently in their personal capacity. So the governments, the organizations understand that they're nominating someone who has that ability and that the work they do within the permanent forum meetings and conversations and the decision-making process, they do it based on their experience and their personal ability. So unlike the MRIP, which is the expert mechanisms on the rights of indigenous peoples, the permanent forum has its own secretariat. It's the only UN body that has its own secretariat. So it has its own support team. They have a leader within that organization and staff to support the permanent forum's work. So with this, I conclude my formal presentation, or at least, I'm sorry, conclude the part on the permanent forum. Joy, I don't know how much time I have. Do I need to go move faster? How am I doing with time?
We have a lot of time, brother. It's okay. As much as you need.
Okay. So So I have time, so better. Better. Bueno, ahora en cambio voy a pasar a la parte del relator especial sobre los
Okay,
derechos.
now I'm going to talk about the special rapporteur. And as I said, they only asked me to talk about the permanent forum, but I think it's crucial to understand as well this mechanism. And the next one I'm going to talk to you about, because that way you can see the difference among them, how the work is different and how they do their work. So the special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples is a specific process within the UN. It's on human rights. What do I mean by this? It's a specific process, human rights process within the UN, because there's special rapporteurs for different issues, such as for freedom of expression, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a special rapporteur for different issues. And the special rapporteur for the rights of indigenous peoples is just one of them. And this mechanism focuses on, as you can see, they're part of the special procedure system, and they're selected through a mechanism by the Human Rights Council. There's a nomination that is independent, not like I said for the permanent forum. There are nominations by the government, nominations by indigenous peoples organizations. So no, this is different. So it's not like that. Here, there is an open call, and you can review that. It's every few years when the mandate is ending. This year, the mandate for the special rapporteur is ending. It started in 2020, and that is for Latin America. I will go into detail in another slides. I'll show you.
So there have been many rapporteurs, and I won't name them all, but you have this sort of call for who the next rapporteur will be. And then there's an internal process inside the Human Rights Council that evaluates different aspects of the person, experience, publications, academic aspects. Many, many things are taken into account by the council. And at the end, the rapporteur is designated by the president through a special session of the Human Rights Council. So what does the rapporteur do? They promote best practices. They work with governmental programs, et cetera, to be able to apply the international resolutions on human rights. So they formulate recommendations and specific proposals to provide reparations for the violation of human rights. They also present reports on human rights violations, the rights of indigenous peoples, and so about the rights, and then also about the violation of those rights. So I don't know if you've heard, but the special rapporteurs, at the end of their visits to the countries, because they do make visits to countries, they present a report. And inside their report, they say, okay, we have gone to country X, let's say Costa Rica. And they say, well, in Costa Rica, the special rapporteur had the opportunity to meet with academics, with leaders of indigenous peoples, with government representatives. We visited various places in the country. And in the end, this is what I have seen. This is my assessment. We've seen this, this, and this. And these things could be done. So that's one of the primary actions and activities that the Special Rapporteur's Office does, is to visit these countries and to make these reports. However, I want to be very clear. The Special Rapporteurs cannot present a report on a country if they haven't gone to the country. They have to have visited the country to to do a report and to visit the country, they have to have received an invitation by the government of that country. So it could be that there's a situation developing, say, in Chile. Sorry, I'm just using examples of countries in Latin America. And sorry about that, but those are the ones that come to mind first. So say there's a situation in Chile and different people ask for the presence of the special rapporteur in Chile. But the special rapporteur can't go to Chile to do an official visit and to present that report on the official visit if they haven't received an official invitation from the government. So the government has an authority in this case, usually the foreign minister, and so the foreign minister has to receive has to give the invitation to visit Chile, and if they don't get that invitation, they can't go and evaluate the situation and make a report. They can't do it. They have to be invited by the government. So the special rapporteur can visit Chile, maybe in an academic context, which is what I'm seeing is happening a lot in terms of the current special rapporteur on indigenous rights, but they can't issue an official report unless they're on an official business. It's not like they can't visit the country. They can go, but they can't present or issue an official report. And they can only issue a report if they've coordinated that visit with the government. They've received an invitation, and within the framework of that visit, there's a number of coordinations they have to do with the government. So obviously, when they do receive an invitation, they can say, I want to meet this, and that group. I want to visit this territory. And, that rapporteur's already received a number of alerts about whatever's happening in the region of a particular country. And through the rapporteur's team, they can organize an agenda. But as I mentioned, they have to go at the invitation of the government. But that's not just true for the rapporteur. Any special procedures of the Human Rights Council to present a report on a human rights situation has to come from having gone on an official visit to the country through an invitation. If not, it's not considered an official visit. But, okay, the rapporteur's office can issue declarations on a situation without necessarily going. So they can't do a report maybe, but they can do a declaration, a statement. So they can, you can send emails to the rapporteur's office. You can communicate with them and say, look, here's an alert of a specific situation that's happening in Brazil, in Chile, in Peru, Ecuador, Panama, wherever. So here's the situation. Please make a statement about it. And now the permanent forum can't do that, and the expert mechanism can't do that. But the special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples can do that. So it's that space where they address alleged human rights violations. Is that clear in terms of the special rapporteurship? So then we can ask, do some questions and answers if you want to clarify. The previous special rapporteurs were the first one who was from 2001 to 2008. That was Rodolfo Stavenhagen. Then we had Professor James Anaya from the United States, 2008 to 2014. And then from 2014 to 2020, we had Victoria Taulicorpus. Currently, the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Rights of Indigenous Peoples is Francisco Cali Sai, and he began his mandate in 2020. And as I mentioned, he's just about to finish his term this year in 2023. I hope, as a Latin American, that he will continue with another mandate because it is possible to have 2 terms. And that applies to the members of the Permanent Forum as well. you can be reelected for one additional period, but that's all. You can't be reelected again after that. So in the case of Francisco, he has the possibility, if he wants to, and within the procedures of the election of the special rapporteurs, he could have an additional mandate of 3 more years. So we will know about that in the upcoming session of the Human Rights Council in May, whether Francisco will continue or whether there will be a new rapporteur elected. Here it seems important to me that, and personally anyway, I believe that special rapporteurs need to be diverse by region. And you're going to say, yeah, but Rodolfo Stevenhagen was representing Mexico, but Rodolfo was not an indigenous person. At the very beginning, and as it occurred in the expert mechanisms on the rights of indigenous peoples, at the beginning, even though these were spaces that indigenous peoples had earned and fought for, they weren't being represented by indigenous peoples in those spaces. And I assume that at that point there were no experts, people considered experts at that time. That's what I assume. But now a special rapporteur, any members of the permanent forum have to be indigenous. And so that's why I'm very happy that spaces like FEMI exist. And I hope that some of you or some of your predecessors will be members of the expert mechanism someday, that you'll be members of the permanent forum. And so it would be great to have a woman rapporteur again, because we as indigenous people in these years have the capacity to do that. We have the experience of working in the territory. We have our own experience of living. We understand our reality. And we're also being trained. And so I want to congratulate you. We always congratulate people who take part in this training program of FEMI. And I want to encourage you to think about occupying some of these spaces inside the UN mechanisms. I would love to see FEMI women members of the permanent forum, the special mechanism, and to become a special rapporteur. So here the first rapporteur was Rodolfo Stevenhagen, and he was from Mexico. But as an indigenous person, I say that the first indigenous person from Latin America who has been a special rapporteur is, in fact, Francisco Cali. So I hope he gets another term, and then I hope it goes to another region. Perhaps we've had a representative from North America, and we've had a representative from Philippines and Asia, and we've had a Latin American representative. So there are other regions as well that need to be represented here. So I hope that will be taken into account for the next special rapporteurs that are named. So we can end here what has to do with the Special Rapporteur's Office, and we can talk a little bit about the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, MRIP. I've put 2007 down as the year of creation, although there were some prior things that happened. For the writing of the Declaration on the Rights of Human Rights, or the rights of indigenous peoples, there was a group of indigenous experts that were gathered together to write the declaration. The declaration was finally adopted with some changes, but this working group basically worked on the declaration within the UN system, and that work was continued, not just on the declaration anymore, because that had been approved, but it became a space for the expert mechanisms on the rights of Indigenous people. So it came together in 2007 officially, and it was formed by just 5 members. You might remember it is not very strange because the system for electing people that the states had was kind of that way, to have 5 members. But in 2017, I believe there were some changes and the mandate was expanded and the number of expert mechanisms was expanded. So that was changed to 7 members. So currently it has 7 members. And those are the people who provide the advising, because it's an advising mechanism to the Human Rights Council in issues that have to do with Indigenous peoples. They also carry out studies. They clarify fundamental principles, examine practices, they look at the challenges, they make suggestions to the states. And what's fundamental is that as the final declaration of the rights of Indigenous peoples was being examined, then member states said, okay, well, you already have 3 mechanisms. Why do we need another mechanism? You have the permanent forum, you have different entities, but why aren't these entities working together? So in 2014, the final document of the World Conference generated the mandate of modifying the original mandate of the expert mechanism so that it would have a coordinator role as well, and that it would better represent the reality. So now, as I mentioned, it has 7 experts. They meet always in Geneva, and they have 5 days period of sessions. As I had mentioned before, the expert mechanism is made up of these 7 experts. They get together and they open up the space to listen to member state, to listen to Indigenous peoples, to listen to non-governmental organizations, anybody who's working on Indigenous peoples issues, on specialized agencies. So they're listening to all of these groups that are working on these issues. And then they also come out with reports. Now, I want to talk a little bit now. And I've divided up the 3 mechanisms in this way to compare them, so you can be a little clear about what each one does. So, like, I don't know if this information is more confusing. If so, I'm very sorry. Because there is a lot of information, a lot of different entities here to talk about, and it's a lot to take in. So I just want to invite you to participate in the sessions of the Permanent Forum and to participate in the expert mechanism sessions, because everything that I'm saying you're going to be able to understand better once you are there and participating. So beyond any collaboration that you might have through FEMI, be aware of the Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples that periodically put a call out to get participation from Indigenous peoples to attend the Permanent Forum or to attend the expert mechanism. So I'm not sure what information channels you have, but hopefully you will hear about these things. And there's a Facebook page for the Voluntary Fund, and periodically they'll say, okay, for example, right now, they have put out a call for Indigenous peoples representatives to participate in the universal periodic reviews of the various countries. And it's not very updated in Spanish, but it is updated in English, and you can see which call is current. And if you follow that Facebook page, maybe they also have something on Instagram. There, you can follow them on Twitter. You can follow any of these pages, and you can see when calls come out. So you can apply, and you could have the opportunity to attend the permanent forum or the expert mechanism. And this is very enriching because you can understand better how these work. So I'm talking about theory and how they work, but when you go to the sessions, you can see what these groups do. And please remember, oh yeah, Diego told us that we should attend and that we would understand better when we came. And oh, I remember that he said that there's reports that are done at the end of these processes. So it is important to understand how these reports come out. And if you attend, you need to be prepared with a statement and to approach the members of the forum and of the expert mechanism and say, look, in Ecuador, this is happening, and in Chile, this is happening, in the Philippines, this is happening, in the US, this is happening, to go with information about what's happening in your area. And that way you can amplify your voice and be taken into account when they write the report. Some of the things that you mentioned can be included in the report. So this is a part of the work that FEME does, is to put out reports. And what I would recommend is that you go with a very clear message and that you try to work on recommendations that go along with the agenda that they have. Unfortunately, in the permanent forum, if they're dealing with health and the main debate is on health, and sometimes people end up at these meetings and they talk about other things, but of course they're not going to be included in the report because they're not talking about health. So they didn't find the best space to be able to explain their concern. Or maybe they went on for too long and they were cut off at the microphone, and so they weren't able to make their main points. So as soon as sometimes they give you 3 minutes, 4 minutes, you have to choose the right space to make your statement, and you have to approach other actors to talk about how important this is, the members of the permanent forum, members of the expert mechanisms, and then you have to prepare a very brief and concise statement. So recommendations for the future. Okay, so how do these 3 things work? The permanent forum on the left meets for 2 weeks, usually in April or May. Sometimes it's the last couple of weeks in April, sometimes the last in April and the first week in May, and sometimes it's the first 2 weeks in May, but it's always around that time. There's 10 days of meetings during 2 weeks. So that's why I put 2 weeks down. Now the expert mechanism only meets for 1 week. So, okay, and the permanent forum is 2 weeks in New York, and the expert mechanism is 1 week in Geneva. The expert mechanism meetings usually happen in the month of July. The special rapporteur on the 3rd column does not call meetings. What they do is that they visit countries or they put out communications, but they don't have 1 week or 2 week period of meetings where a bunch of people come together. It is important to be alert as to whether your country has invited the rapporteur, or perhaps motivate the country to receive the rapporteur. And within the framework of those visits, the visits might last 1 or 2 weeks, but that's the space for working with the special rapporteur's office. So they will work specifically on your country about a particular issue there. Or you can talk to them about what's happening directly through any of the channels that they may have open in the special rapporteur's page, that you can find those channels through the web page. And there will be an email there where you can send your concerns. Now, the Permanent Forum, back in the first column, has a full-time secretariat, as I mentioned before, and it's working on Permanent Forum matters all year long. The expert mechanism does not have its own secretariat. It has one that is shared with the High Commissioner's office. And once you get to the session with the High Commissioner on Human Rights, you can figure out sort of how the MRIP or the expert mechanism is supported. Now, the Special Rapporteur's Office in the third column, they have a secretariat and some support persons. But that's also coordinated through the High Commission of the United Nations. Permanent Forum is housed, as I mentioned in the first slide, it's sort of under the General Assembly. The expert mechanism and the Special Rapporteur's Office fall under the Human Rights Council. CDH is written on the screen, but it's the Human Rights Council. The Permanent Forum, you can approach them informally. You can invite members of the Permanent Forum, of either the Permanent Forum or the expert mechanisms. They always, decide who their chair is going to be, and normally the chair is going to be present in all the activities, but they don't have mandates to go to a country and visit a country and to do any kind of official report about the situation in that country. They can visit the country in official capacity, but it would still be considered informal. And when I say informal, meaning they haven't received an invitation from the government, and it's the Permanent Forum, it's not their job to go to a country to evaluate the situation and to come out with suggestions. That's not the job of an expert mechanism, or not. What MRIP and the Permanent Forum can do is to facilitate dialogue. That's their main function. But there's that mandate of going to a country and visiting only belongs to the Special Rapporteur's Office, and they have to do an official visit with a government invitation. The Permanent Forum can advise or Indigenous peoples organizations or government organizations directly. And so Indigenous peoples can ask for that. They can ask for a training, they can ask for advice from the Permanent Forum within the context of the competencies it has. But there should be a request that is made. Now, they can't go and train government agencies officially. They have to receive an invitation and then they can do it. But they can because they're experts on these topics. The Special Rapporteur could provide advising, but only informally. Again, if they don't receive an official invitation, they can do anything possible within an academic meeting or other meetings, that's fine, but that's considered informal also, unless they have an official invitation. Same thing in terms of visiting countries, making statements to the press. Really, only the Special Rapporteur is going to do that after an official visit. The special mechanism and the Permanent Forum are not going to do declarations or statements from the UN to the press. That's only within the purview of the Special Rapporteur's Office. So these are some of the differences that you can find between these three main bodies that work on Indigenous issues. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about another issue. So this is the meeting room for the General Assembly. And so here there's a little section on Indigenous peoples and the General Assembly of the UN. And so what am I referring to here? At the beginning of my presentation, in the first slide, there was an arrow that talked about the work of, or the Indigenous peoples' issues were being discussed in the General Assembly and in the committees in particular. And I highlighted that because that's where the negotiations happen, and that's where resolutions are adopted. What corresponds to the UN Declaration and to the World Conference, what came out of there are documents that were adopted within the framework of an official negotiation. Now, it took more than 20 years for the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to be written, but in the end, when it was approved for the adoption by the General Assembly, it was the states modified the declaration before it was approved. Why? Because the General Assembly was adopting it. And who makes up the General Assembly? The 193 member states. So any kind of resolution or declaration that comes out of the General Assembly has to be known by the member states, and they can't adopt statements that the member states are not going to approve of. So there has to be a lot of negotiation with the states. But who has voice and vote in these spaces?
Entonces, no, acá no puede el foro permanente decir, bueno,
The
mire.
United States. So the permanent forum cannot say, yes, I think it's important what Canada has said, but they don't have the ability to go against a modification. The permanent forum, the expert mechanism, not the rapporteur, special rapporteur. So what's negotiated by the I'm sorry, the interpreter misspoke before. The ones who have the power are is the member states. So currently, what we have that is most advanced is the declaration by the United Nations and the final document adopted in the framework of the World Conference. But talking about the World Conference, I would like to highlight that it comes from the resolution, or their mandate comes from that conference, the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, which was presented at their main commission, which is the third commission. So each year, this is how the resolution is presented at this commission. And as an example, we've been able to have through them the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. We were able to start also the process on how to better improve the participation of Indigenous peoples at the UN. That was also possible only through the Third Commission of the United Nations. Also, the issue of the Conference on Indigenous Languages also, as well as others. This was all achieved through this Third Commission. I highlight this space because this is where actions that the United Nations system has to carry out happen. I don't know whether you know about this, but the General Assembly resolutions are not binding for the member states. That is, a resolution that is adopted at the General Assembly doesn't obligate a country or government to commit to actions towards the concerns reflected on that resolution. The countries may adopt or do something in good faith. They have political goodwill, let's say. But why do I highlight the importance of this? Because even though there's no mandate that obligates the states, it does give it to the United Nations system. What do I mean by that? Yes, if the states decide that there should be an Indigenous Language International Year, and it gives the UNESCO that mandate, the UNESCO has to do it. If within the resolution of the Third Commission, they say that UNICEF ONU, UN Women, if they have to do a certain action, they have to do it. Why? Because the resolution of the Third Commission says that they have to do it. So if they say that we need to expand, as they did a few years ago, we have to do that as well. So before, they said that they could only attend the permanent forum, but then it expanded so that they could also attend MRIP meetings, so that they could also participate in discussions on climate change, sustainable development, etc. So the mandate is given in this resolution, and that's why they have to assume they have to do it within the United Nations system. I don't know if that was clear. Other intergovernmental yes, the other 6 commissions, or rather outside of the 6 commissions, such as in the Paris Agreement, which is a document that was negotiated within the framework of the Convention on Climate Change, there are many meetings, there are many things that are happening throughout. So there is a possibility for Indigenous peoples to be involved here. Why? So that unlike in other legal documents, at least in this one, there could be, so that there could be references to the needs of Indigenous peoples on that subject. For example, the Agenda 2030 on Sustainable Development contains references to Indigenous peoples, but the previous one, the one on Millennium Development or Goals, it didn't contain any references to Indigenous peoples. So if their committees are not settled, and there's the Third Commission, etc., there are opportunities. This is happening. So we need to get involved in these discussions, the ones where we're allowed, where our voices are. This last year, new mechanisms have been developed that we need to explore and take advantage of. A couple of years ago, FILAC obtained the category of permanent observer that can attend the meetings. Recently, another regional body was able to obtain that. So there's also work being done in terms of the participation of Indigenous peoples, and we hope that this doesn't take many more years so that they can obtain the category of participation as Indigenous peoples in these conversations. So things that allow more advocacy. So some may say, if NRIP or the permanent forum don't have specific advocacy with the states, or if their report. Okay, so if the General Assembly resolutions are legally binding, that the states have to comply, are not binding, that the states don't have to comply with, even less the MRIC or permanent forum reports. So you might say, why are we there then? What's the goal? I can tell you that the design of indigenous peoples
o se pudo obtener un diseño de lenguas indígenas
was obtained
gracias a las
thanks
recomendaciones
to the
permanentes,
recommendations
precisamente gracias a las
by the
recomendaciones
Permanent
del
Forum and by
este
NREP.
trabajo. Mire, o sea, nuestra justificación cuando estábamos
Our
buscando
justification
avanzar a
when
la
we
legislación de
were
lenguas indígenas,
seeking
la
having the
la
indigenous
primera, en la primera
languages
reunión del Foro
year
Permanente
at the
de
very
Expresiones
first
Indígenas, ya se
Permanent
advirtió
Forum
sobre la grave
of
situación de
indigenous
las lenguas indígenas y se hizo
people's
esa
issues,
recomendación.
they already
Luego, en el 2013, ese
alerted to the
Foro
fact
Permanente lo
of the
recomendó.
danger of
Luego, en el
indigenous
2015,
peoples'
pasó esto.
languages.
Luego, en el
Then there were
ámbito del
recommendations in
trabajo del
different
mecanismo,
spaces. Then
se llamó a una
the
comisión
expert
interinstitucional
mechanisms on the
de
rights of
lenguas
indigenous
indígenas
peoples
sobre
also
esta
had
situación.
a specific meeting
Luego, el
on
Foro Permanente,
indigenous
por
languages.
esta grave
Then the
situación,
Permanent
convocó
Forum,
uno de
because of the
expertos en
seriousness
el
of the
2016.
situation,
Entonces,
called
todo
a
esto va
specific
sumando,
meeting of
va
experts. So
sumando.
all of
Los
these things,
entrenamientos
actions add
en
up.
estos
And
espacios
the more of those
son
that we
justificativos
have
porque son
reflected on these
complementarios.
other spaces,
Yo les
reports,
pongo un
etc.,
ejemplo con relación
could
a
create
las
that
lenguas indígenas, pero
awareness.
esto habrá en un
So I'm
sinnúmero de
talking about
temas
recommendations on indigenous
que
languages,
todos
but
los
there are
meses
many more
buscamos
topics
que se desarrollen
that we indigenous
algún tipo
peoples
de acción.
seek
Entonces, para eso es
to
importante
develop and we
que
seek action on.
asistir al foro permanente,
So it's
asistir a
important
NREP,
to attend the Permanent
expresar,
Forum,
manifestar
to go to MRIP,
lo que está
and to
sucediendo y
express
buscar mecanismos que
what's
permiten
happening, to
articular
seek
una solución
mechanisms that allow us to
para
articulate a
el proyecto.
solution.
Entonces,
So that's where I'm
el
going.
diseño de lenguas indígenas que actualmente lo
So the
celebramos cada 2030
decade of the
además
indigenous languages that we're celebrating right now came
o
from
pudo ser posible gracias a todo este trabajo.
all of that work,
Gracias a que el relator especial también en algún
thanks to
foro,
the fact that the
en algún
special
momento expresó
repertoire
que
also
es necesario trabajar
expressed that
Entonces, todos suman,
and
todos suman.
a
Y
report.
son los espacios
Everything
donde
adds
los representantes de
up.
pueblos indígenas
And those are the
tienen que
spaces also
participar
where
para que los
representatives of
candidatos
indigenous
expresen
peoples
estas situaciones y se puedan
need to
atender.
participate so that all of
Esto
these
es todo,
issues are
señoría
brought
de
to
la mesa.
light
Con
and
esto yo
so we can seek action.
cierro mi presentación.
Thank
Les
you so much,
agradezco
dear
mucho
sisters. I conclude my
por
presentation with this, and I
escucharme,
thank you very much for
por
listening
tenerme
to me
paciencia
and
y
being patient with
si es
me.
mucha información,
And if it is a lot of
pido mis disculpas
information, I
en no ser tan
apologize
claro, pero
for that.
sí,
Also, if I
ya
couldn't
después
be
de
more
todo el
clear
tiempo
in
vuelvo a
some
registrar
instances,
que
but
estoy a las órdenes.
I am here for you if you need clarification on anything. Thank you so much, Diego. Thank you for sharing all of that experience, that information of the achievements and the conquests that our leaders have been able to achieve before us. All of this information has not been easy. This is all the product of many years of work. And it is now our responsibility to know how the UN systems work in detail, especially everything related to our rights as indigenous peoples. Diego has been one of our allies, and we need to take advantage of that information, that experience. And now we invite all the participants to ask questions because it'd be good to take advantage of his knowledge and his time, the time he's offering to us. And perhaps one of you one day can get to one of those spaces to advocate in favor of the rights of indigenous peoples. So now I give the floor to our leaders, our women leaders, to ask their questions or comments. But the most important thing here is to take advantage of the experience that we have here with us today. So the time is yours now to share your comments and ask your questions. So go ahead, please.
Hermana, a veces el silencio asusta porque
Sisters,
todo
sometimes
claro, pero
silence
no se
is
entiende
scary
nada.
because either everything is completely clear or nothing was understood. That happens to all of us. Silence is one of the elements present in this edition, in this class. But while people thinking about their questions, I have a question for you, Diego. Concerning the visits by special repertoires to Indigenous peoples, who makes the invitation? The government, or can it be a civil society organization? The government, my sister. But I can tell you that you can't initiate the request of that invitation to the government. For example, in Ecuador, on the second occasion, we've received 2 visits. A couple of years ago, Professor Anaya visited the country officially, and then 2017, I think it was, or 2018, I don't remember the specific year, we also had another visit by Vicky Talis, the special rapporteur at that time. I remember that those meetings, those visits, were the product of the collaboration between Indigenous peoples organizations and the government, initiated in New York. I remember when one of the representatives of Indigenous women from Ecuador made that request. They came to New York with one request, just one, and that was the one request to the representative that was at that time in the United States. I'm sorry, the United Nations. And that is that they wanted the special rapporteur to visit Ecuador. That was the only request they had. And then there was more work done. They approached other spaces available to them. And in the end, they achieved that the government invite the special repertoire. So my sister Hortensia, if there's interest on any of the Indigenous peoples group in having a special repertoire visit their country, that action is to be initiated by approaching the different spaces in New York, whatever. Diplomats are not just the ones who hold that position at various times, formally in embassies or different missions. No, it's not just that. I know sisters who are great diplomats because they have sought, they have advocated a lot, looking for this kind of work so that these visits take place. What you do need is coordination, articulation of that request. So do make those requests, but for a special repertoire, not only just for Indigenous people or any other issue, for them to visit a country, they need to receive a specific invitation by the government. Thank you, Diego, for that clarification. I think that governments sometimes feel obligated to provide information on the rights of Indigenous peoples because of that work. I have a comment in the chat by Elizabeth saying that in the period, how can we participate? How we can Indigenous peoples participate in the periodic reviews of the countries? It's not exclusive to Indigenous peoples, but at the same time, how do we make it? How do we make our demands or requests more visible? If they don't, if our requests, our demands are not happening. And Diego says, before answering that question, let's hear Juliana's question. Juliana says, thank you, Diego, for this information, so crucial for us. I have a question. It is true that the states invite. My question is, do they have funding to mobilize, or do we need funding for that? Because sometimes the spaces are created, invitations are made, but then it's not possible to get to the countries, let alone get to the territories to listen to the peoples, Indigenous peoples themselves. So is there specific financing for the special repertoire to get to the country when invited? Thank you, Juliana, for this question. As far as I know, this is going to depend on the countries. Juliana, we have a situation we face actually that we face different countries, developing countries, and that is that we don't have funding. But I can tell you that so far, we have not seen that as a limitation to allow special rapporteurs to visit countries. Funding has not been a limitation. Special rapporteurs are able to get the funds to go to the countries. However, it's going to depend a lot on how open the country is and the resources a country can offer, so that and within their visit and depending on the economic ability they have, they're going to offer more mobilization inside the country, for example, to visit territories, etc. But unfortunately, that is a reality that developing countries have. That is, we don't have enough resources, so that when we invite someone, that they can be invited with an ample budget. But so far, Juliana, as far as I know, resources or funding has not been the limitation for a special repertoire to come to a country once invited. And the UN system mechanisms have been generated to find the funding, to come up with the funding. Okay, I think I answered Juliana's question, but I'm going to add something else. What Hortensia asked, oh, I'm sorry, what Elizabeth asked. I don't know a whole lot about that, but let me give you what I know. This mechanism that was created in 2006, if I'm not mistaken, when the Council on Human Rights was created. Before, you had the Commission on Human Rights, then the Council was created, and the review of the situation of human rights was done through this mechanism, but in a selective way. Once it changed, the mandate changed, and the name changed to from the Commission to Council. Also, the periodic review on universal rights was created, and this means that every country has to have a periodic review of their human rights situation. Not just one country, but all the countries. Every certain number of years, they have to present their reality. That is the opportunity the states have to talk about all the positive work they've done, but then there are also mechanisms aside for the civil societies in general, and that is where indigenous peoples come together to talk about their situation. So one thing would be to take a look at what country is going to review it when, and then you have to see the timeline to send your reports. With this process, the space is open for different organizations, other bodies that are not just the state other organizations can present their reports to be taken into account during the universal periodic review of the country. Let me add something else. When the universal periodic review is made, the recommendations also come from other states. So it's important to have connections with other governments, other states, so that they can also make recommendations on the other states. For example, Ecuador when there is another, when the universal periodic review of another country is being made, Ecuador can give recommendations on that other country and vice versa. Now, for example, is Mexico, Mexico's turn. So we have to look at the timeline. And when the reports are sent, it's not that they would say, no, you can't because you're a civil organization. No, that's not why. The important thing is to understand where the process is and then send the reports. And then at the appropriate time, they will be reflected in the webpage of the respective country. All will be included. So they might say, for this country, all these various organizations or bodies have issued their recommendations, and those are included there. I don't know whether I answered your question, Elizabeth, but that's a little bit of how that is done, how the universal periodic reviews are done. Thank you, Diego. Now we see Siobhan's hand raised, so please, Siobhan, ask your question or make your comment, please.
Hi, Diego. This is Siobhan. Thank you for your presentation. So my question is about sort of the process after a country has kind of used all of the mechanisms available to them at the UN. So I'm from Guam, and in the past less than 2 years, we've recently, one in March 2021, Guam submitted a joint allegation letter submitted by 3 UN special rapporteurs to the US government concerning human rights issues here. And then following that, we've been kind of having ongoing meetings and sessions and participating in sessions permitting to like decolonization. So right now, for me, I'm in a position where I see that Guam has a very active history in the past couple, like 5-10 years, longer than that, of going to the UN and advocating for our rights. We've had many special rapporteurs visit and make reports. The most recent one was, I think, the special rapporteur on minority issues. But the joint allegation letter was submitted by the ones on Indigenous human rights, and I think 2 other special rapporteurs. But the results of that kind of activity was that the US government kind of just dismissed and refused to kind of communicate with Guam as if we were equals. And I feel like for me, the struggle that I see with Guam is that because our administering power, like because the American government never acknowledges or never goes through the correct channels of communication with us, it's very difficult when our human rights issues in Guam are being recognized by the UN and even other international communities, but our own administering power, the US, is very like dismissive. And so recently, in just different activist communities, we're continuing to try and push for rights to self-determination as like a mechanism, but it's just very difficult for me because in my mind we're kind of doing all of the right things, but the US is such a powerful nation and it's so hard to imagine them ever listening or being held accountable by even like the UN. And it was a really big deal to get 3 rapporteurs to sign on to this joint allegation letter. And it felt good to have that much solidarity from the UN and different international communities, but personally, I feel really discouraged every time I think of how the US was able to just like dismiss that letter and kind of just move on. And sometimes I struggle with, so I'm in a situation where I'm wondering, what do you do after you've kind of had the special rapporteurs visit and the reports have been made? because it feels like we're kind of revisiting the same mechanism every time, and I almost feel like I feel stuck. But sorry if that was a really long question, but anyways, yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
What difficult question.
Sorry.
But difficult in the way that unfortunately I don't have like the solution
Mm,
in the way that I cannot say you, if you do this, this is gonna happen. Why? Because you know, as I mentioned during my intervention, um, you know, what we have as indigenous peoples, I mean, the the biggest and the primary instrument that we have under the UN is a declaration.
mm,
And I can say it's just a declaration because will be better to us. I am the persons or the expert that I believe that to have more impact in our struggles will be better to have a convention, you know, for indigenous people. I don't know if I'm going to have the opportunity to see that, but so far, what we have is a declaration. Is like the biggest thing that we have at the UN, and even to have that declaration, it takes more than 30 years, you know, of negotiations of different kind of wars to have it. You know, it's just less than 20 years than we are recognized as indigenous peoples at the UN level, because in the past that also was a struggle. So what I'm trying to say with this is that unfortunately I cannot give you like a specific solution. Just give me 1 minute. So sorry. My family was around. So what I would like to invite is to not disappoint. I mean,
mm,
you have to continue fighting. I think that the thing is not not feel disappointed. You need to continue fighting, and for all and everyone that we are here, we have to continue fighting. You know, we just recently been in a meeting regarding the participation of indigenous people. So we were thinking, we are going to wait 10, 30, 10 years more. We don't know. We don't know. We don't have the answer for that. But what we cannot do is to give up. We need to continue. And probably you mentioned that you already have visits from different reporters. I don't know in which way, if it's specifically regarding indigenous peoples, is this has been recognized or is part of the report of the permanent forum, or is part of the report of the NRIP. I don't know if this matter is analyzed by the committee of decolonization. So now we start thinking in which other space you have to put it, you have to include this aspect. And it is specific about indigenous people to find those spaces and include it, and don't give up. That my I say, unfortunately, I cannot give you an answer for the solution, but my recommendation is not give up. You know, our fighting, our struggles takes years, and the multilateral negotiations takes too long,
mm,
unfortunately. But that is how the multilateral world works. But
mhm,
we need to continue trying to navigate on those spaces, and for sure, I'm sure that this struggle with the time will have the result that we expect.
Thank you.
Gracias, Yvonne. También queremos
Thank you, Siobhan. We also want to continue inviting you to ask questions.
Hortensia, creo que Anima, me parece que está levantada la mano.
Hortensia, it seems that Anima has her hand up.
Ánima, por favor.
Anima, go ahead.
¿Escuchamos?
Yes.
You have the floor.
Yes. Hello.
Sí,
Good
hola,
evening.
saludos, buenas noches.
Thank you so much, sir.
Muchas
Your
gracias
presentation was
por
really helpful to me.
su
And
presentación. A mí me
from
ayudó
your
mucho.
presentation,
Y de su
I
presentación, I'm
understood
sorry.
that the role of a special rapporteur is very important, I guess, in terms of more than the forum and anything else. I think the special rapporteur has a very powerful place. And also, the sister earlier from Guam have shared, her, sadness that, her place was visited, but somehow I think the report was not up to the mark. That's what I understood. But what I'm trying to understand is that I'm from Tripura, which is in India, and Tripura is the northeast part of India. Joy is also from there, so I think she'll be able to connect. Now, sir, my question is that whenever we talk about human rights, people from the other part of the country, they only understand about India is they only understand about the caste system, the higher caste and the lower caste in India. But apart from that, we have we have 8 states in the northeastern part of India, and I'm concerned about that. And I'm talking about my state, which is Tripura. We have a very long boundary with Bangladesh, and because of which our indigenous communities actually extinguishing. And somehow my question here is that even if I want to request the special rapporteur to come here and see the situation here of our indigenous community, the government would not uh, take our side and grant that request. So how do we go about that in that case? So will our voice be never heard in the UN is my question, first thing. And second thing, I do agree that you have mentioned that it just started in 2000. So we have a long way to go. We're just, we have just stepped in, and it's a process. So I also understand that. However, when we are still learning at this stage, so my question is somehow that how are we trying to reach the UN when our government is against? I mean, they don't even know what part of Northeast is actually in what situation. So that was my question. I don't know if I'm able to explain my question.
Hi, Anima. Well, I think I understood. I understood. I understood.
Thank
well,
you.
what I can say in this aspect is kind of similar that I recommend to see Sibon. I hope I said correctly her name. Well, this is a struggle that face many indigenous peoples around the world. And somehow it's going to probably is not a surprise to you, but when I was attending meetings, I heard many times we don't have indigenous peoples in our country. So when we were trying to discuss or trying to how we are going to advance regarding to enhance the participation of indigenous people, we also have to be like patient and to say, okay, no, we have to understand the reality of the different regions. So far in Latin America, at least it's clear who are and who don't are indigenous peoples. But this is not clear and not something that is recognized, basically. To correct myself, is something that is not recognized for in other regions or in other countries. So the struggles for our other brother and sister around the world is even harder, you know. So recommendation, I mean, continue making arrangement and approaching uh, government, you know, don't give up in that aspect. Trying to find in some way, in some period of time, you are going to have that opportunity. So continue with that struggle. Continue participating in these spaces. For example, you mentioned, yes, the special rapporteur mandate is unique and is powerful, but he need to visit the country, otherwise he cannot give a report about that. But you can participate in the permanent forum session, you can participate in the entry, and you can say, you know, and you can expose your reality, and you can approach the members of this mechanism and to say, you know, is this important to us because we didn't have the opportunity to receive the visit of the special report. So you still have spaces that can be used so far. But as I mentioned, you know, even though, imagine this, even though this aspect of indigenous language that we can say is something easy to adopt, it was difficult. And you know, since the permanent forum start the work, was expressed the importance to address these aspects. It was not possible until 2018. So take us too long. And it was something that I believe is not controversial, you know. I mean, we are losing our languages. We need to find some solution. We need to call the international. That was really difficult. So imagine if in that not controversial issue was difficult. So we need to recharge our energy and continue finding these ways and don't give up, as I mentioned before, because one day it's going to align the actors, the spaces that allow, for example, in your case, to have the visit. Or because of this attention that is captured by different in different level by the EMRI, by the permanent forum session, but the other spaces that you may have the opportunity to express what is happening. Someone is going to, you are going to call the attention in someone and say, okay, we need to do something. Because, you know, at the end, when the special reporter visit the country and make the recommendation, it also depends of the state how it's going to take the recommendation. But it's part of the process, you know. I hope this is not a conversation or a discussion to give you a disappointment of the multilateral world. But that is how the multilateral world works, with patience and step by step, and trying to find my recommendation is to continue participating and highlighting and finding the specific strategy that this can be done.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, Anima. Pema.
Hello, am I
Emma, I
audible?
think you're muted.
¿Ahora me escuchan? Sí.
Yeah. So, hello everyone, and I just wanted to highlight a few things. In terms of Nepal, what I want to say is that in contrast to what our sister from Bangladesh shared, in Nepal, our constitutions do recognize indigenous people as we are specifically recognized as indigenous peoples and indigenous community. And even the constitution do acknowledges our rights in a lot of areas, like they give us the proper representation, they give us proper quotation quotas, and what do you call it, reservation in government offices and even government schools in terms of education. And there is also a provision for educate to receive education in our native languages. But what the problem is, that despite being acknowledged and despite even signing to all that UN DRIP and ILO 169, we what we are currently facing is indirect forms of repression from the government. What it is like, our do indigenous people are in our constitution, they do acknowledge that all the people needs to be treated equally, including indigenous people. But in some cases, indigenous peoples, in specifically in terms of their access to land, their access to resources, their access to justice mechanism, it is not specifically mentioned that indigenous people needs to be prioritized, and there needs to be specific measures to ensure that indigenous people have those access to these kind of services. Because a lot of indigenous communities, we all know that a lot of indigenous communities do use their native languages, and they don't have equal access to justice mechanism in terms of language barrier and other things. It is also that in because of the majority of laws and policies are made by non-indigenous peoples, they do not reflect the issues of indigenous people that well. And what that impact is, when we look at the paper, in Nepal, indigenous people do are given proper rights, but when you look at the actual situation of Nepal, a lot of indigenous communities are forgetting their indigenous practices, forgetting their indigenous traditions, because they have to cope up with the majority that has been imposed by our government. Like, in terms of our national language is Nepali, which is not our indigenous language, and because of which, to get that proper education, to get that services, to have access to the resources, we need to adapt to those kind of stuff. And because of that, it is impacting a lot of indigenous communities indirectly. That is not the direct violations of our human rights, but because of that, we are having the transfer of knowledge and the transfer of movement is getting very weak in terms of Nepal. And because of that, there have been a lot of human rights violations indirectly because of those laws. Like, there have been case that in Nepal, our national animal is cow, which is based on the Hindu religion, that is the majority of religion in Nepal, like the religion that is worshipped by the mainstream people in Nepal. And because of that, a lot of communities, because indigenous people in Himalayan region, in a lot of remote areas, they still consume meat of cow, they still consume beef as their food. And because of that, a lot of indigenous people had to go to jail, and they were arrested. And because of their language barrier, they were not able to transfer that. They did not kill the cow, it was already there, and they just used the meat. But these kind of little incidences are very common in a lot of rural areas in Nepal, and those kind of incidences are not correctly addressed by the government. So for that, because these cases are not that widely spread by the news media or even within the movement, these kind of incidences are not that much taken seriously by the government, due to which, and because of all of numerous loopholes within the constitution that does not directly specify indigenous people, a lot of indigenous community face a lot of challenges in their daily lives. But when we talk about these kind of issues, because these are not big human right violations, and they are not big cases, that it is very difficult to bring these kind of challenges, these kind of loopholes in the policies and institutions within the larger discourse of indigenous movement. So what I wanted to ask is, how do we bring these kind of small incidences and this kind of little human right violations and little incidences that happen in our community to the larger discourse, and integrate that into the movement, so that we ensure that these kind of incidences do not happen, or we amend constitution in a way that do address the sufferings of daily life that indigenous people indirectly face due to the lack of direct policies or direct mentioning of indigenous people in the laws. Was I able to convey my message well?
Hi, Pema. Well, thank you so much for all the background and about what is happening in your country. Well, what I can tell you is that to try to amplify what is happening, as I said, it's important to continue participating in the meetings. I really recommend to all of you. Unfortunately, in this occasion, you are not going to participate, or I don't know if some of you are going to participate in the permanent forum. But I duly recommend to participate in the forum and express this aspect, this situation. What I can recommend you is to be strategic. So what as I mentioned in one of the of my presentation, is to analyze, for example, if during the 2 weeks of the permanent forum, the first week and the first issue is going to talk about health, highlight what is happening about health in your country or in your region in that part. When second week they are talking about education, so highlight what is happening in terms of education in your country in that aspect, and approach the UN permanent members in the way that is really important, that for you that can be included in the report, and try to get support from other indigenous people from the other regions about this aspect. So in this way, you are going to gain more voice, and then you have to do the same in the MRIP, and then if it's not included in this year, probably next year. So the idea is continue pushing for that, you know? In that way, it's possible that the particular station in one of your regions or in your country can be part of the report. So having that in the report, then you can continue with next steps. So there is a space to do something under the one of the intergovernmental negotiation, so express that. But you need to see what is important to gain for that, you know. So with that, you can have more and more impact. But you say something that for me is crucial, Pema, that most of the things that are that have been made in many countries are by non-indigenous. So our first struggle is in our own countries, you know, in the way that we have a responsibility as indigenous to get more education, to prepare more. And when we have the opportunity to try to gain those spaces that allow us to change the language, to change our constitution, to change our educational system, you know, that is the main responsibility that we have as indigenous. The international movement or the international actions cannot be impositions to the countries, because as I said, what is adopted in the GA, what is adopted, you know, even though what is adopted right now in the 2030 agenda for sustainable development is not binding, it's not legal, it's not something that they are like generals or they are pillars, you know, in the international, adopted or agreed by the international community, but they are not legally binding for the member state. So that can help us, you know, to say, you know, this was adopted at the UN level, and we are not doing that. So they are like, they are instrument for you. for your struggle, for our struggle in our countries. So we need to see it in that way. That can give us as that can help us, but at the end there are not the solutions. I think the solutions somehow it is continue in our hands, working uh, locally, and I hope that we have to gain those spaces internally to make those changes and be us the one that in the future can go to the international space and say, you know, in the past we used to have this, as you mentioned, but now we changed it and we did it and we are working on that, and not just to go to the international space to say that is happening in the bad way, but that is happening in the positive way because now we are there. And we as indigenous now are making our laws. We are indigenous now are making and transforming our system and all those. Thank you, Pema. Dear Hortensia, dear Joy, I have to leave. I have to, unfortunately, I don't have more time. I just wanted to.
Muchísimas gracias.
Voy a pasar a español.
I'll switch over to Spanish now because I do want to thank all of you for your attention. And I want to just leave you with this last message. The multilateral work. Sorry, the sound cut out here, but it is okay. The multilateral work is very slow and you need patience. But I do invite you to continue to prepare yourselves and to participate when you can in these multilateral spaces. As I told Pema, your participation is something that helps our local internal struggles. So continue working locally and look for ways to reach decision-making spaces where there is power, because only by doing that are we going to be able to find the changes that we need for our peoples and that we desire for our peoples. So let's continue the fight. That's my invitation. Thank you very much, Diego. Thank you for sharing with us, for sharing your time. And we want to take advantage of this time to thank you. And we're about to send you a little certificate of thanks for your time. It says the International Forum of Indigenous Women, FIMI, and the Global School of Indigenous Women's Leadership recognizes Diego Tituania for his participation and contribution in the training of Indigenous leaders from Africa, the Arctic, Asia, Latin America, and the Pacific during the 10th session of the International Program of Human Rights and Advocacy Strategies. With gratitude, Diego, thank you very much. And we're now in this virtual modality, but we hope to be able to greet you personally in the future. And we wish you much success in all of your activities. And may the universe continue to open up roads and paths for you. Thank you very much, Hortensia. Thanks to all of you for the invitation, and thanks to all of the Indigenous women here for your attention. Okay, Winnie, you want to go ahead now? Winnie, the floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you, Diego, for such an amazing session today. We look forward to inviting you in other sessions of the Global School. Thank you for making the time to join us this morning. So we're going to move on to our next session this morning or this evening or afternoon, depending on the time you're in. Just a moment. Can you all hear me properly? Okay,
I
great.
think I can go, right, Winnie? Sorry to interrupt you.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Diego.
Bye-bye. Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
so much,
Bye-bye.
Brother Diego. Thank you.
Thank you, sisters.
All right. So we've had a lot about the permanent forum and all these other um, processes that Indigenous peoples are involved in. And so what we're going to do in the next half hour is that we're going to talk about the statement, because we all have we as a group, we're going to have to develop a statement that is going to be presented at the permanent forum. And so in the next few minutes, I'm going to tell you the steps in which we're going to develop the statement, but also let you know about some of the dates and deadlines that we're going to have in the development of the statement. So maybe I'll start with those first before we can move into the statement. So we'll have um, three regional statements and we'll have one global statement, so that each region will develop a statement on their own, and then we'll have a committee that will join together to join all three statements to make one global statement that we hope can be read during the permanent forum by someone who's going to be there at the time of the forum. So after this, we're going to go into groups where you're going to start discussing the statement, the regional statement, and in those groups, please nominate one person from the group that will join the global committee that will now combine all three statements together. For the sisters from North America and
Las hermanas de
the
Norteamérica.
Pacific, so
Perdón.
Siobhan and Nicole, you will automatically be in the global committee because you're representing your regions. So you'll be in the global committee. So we'll have someone from Asia, Africa, and Latin America join the committee as well. So the dates that you need to have in mind, and maybe Joy, you can help me in putting it in chat so that they can be aware, or they can see it in chat, is on the 13th of March. You need to have completed the regional statement. On the 24th of March, you need to have completed the global statement, because on the 27th, we're going to have a group from FIMI, the political team, who are going to come and review, who are going to come and listen to the statement first of all, and then give us feedback, and then we can finalize it, and it can stay ready before the permanent forum comes around. And so just as you've heard from both Tanya and Deko about the permanent forum, Joy, you have your hand up?
Winnie, I'm so sorry. It's actually the 29th where the political participation team from PME will
29th?
come in, 29th
Okay.
of March.
Sorry about that, everyone. So the 29th.
They will be here with us for about, say, 40 minutes, and then the session on that day will be for 2 hours. Then we can finalize after the inputs.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Joy, for that clarification. So we will have, Joy is going to put it down on chat so that you have reference, and then we'll also remind you in the regional advisors will also remind you before the dates, especially for the deadlines for the global and the regional and the global statements. And throughout this period, you will have you're going to have support from your regional coordinators. So please reach out when you need to ask any questions. So how this will work is that each region will have its own Google Doc that you'll be working on together. So you'll create a Google Doc. Please ensure that you add your regional advisor. Or I think what would be better is each regional advisor will create a Google Doc and add everyone in the region, and then have you all work on the document together, so that we can all be aware of what's happening in the document and and know how the development is going. So when you're developing a statement, number one, what we need to know is that you always have 2 or 3 minutes, depending on how the session goes. There's always 2 or 3 minutes for you to deliver your statements. And we know 2 or 3 minutes is not enough time to deliver your statements because all of us are going through so much in our own communities, and we only have just a few minutes to do this. But unfortunately, that's the realities that are there in the permanent forum, that we only have 2 or 3 minutes. And so when you're developing the statements, you need to have that in mind. So 2 or 3 minutes is basically 1 page of of words. So how the structure of the statement would be, first of all, before you even start developing the statement, you need to know what the theme of the forum is for that year. So the theme of the forum, wait, I'll tell you what the theme for this year is, but your statement is going to be based on the theme of the permanent forum, but also there's the six items that are always discussed in the permanent forum. And so sometimes if you feel like your issues do not fall within the permanent forum theme, what you can do is that you can talk about, there's the 6 mandated areas that you can talk about, and we will have these discussions when we'll tell you about the 6 mandated areas when we go into the group work, so that I can just quickly go through the structure of the statement. So there's the 6 mandated areas, and then there's the theme of the permanent forum. Those are the two things that your statement is going to your statements should be based on. So you will look at what issues are there in your regions, and sometimes we will not be able to mention all the issues that are happening. So you need to be very strategic on what issues you want to highlight on your statement. And so those are the things that you want to look at. And then you will look at some of the recommendations that have been done before that are related to the issues that you have, because we have had thousands of recommendations that have been taken up by the permanent forum. So look at those recommendations and see what has been said or what has been recommended or what actions have been taken based on the issues that you have, and then so that you know so that you're not making a recommendation that had already been made and has already been acted upon. So going into the structure of the statement is you will start by greeting the chair. You will be able to know who the chair of the permanent forum is soon. Last year it was Dario, but he may be changed this year. So depending on who the chair is, you're going to thank the chair for giving you an opportunity for to take the floor. And then after that, you're going to introduce yourself, who you are, what your name, the organization that you're presenting, and the agenda item that you're addressing. So again, back to the permanent forum, there's an agenda for every day. And so you can pick which agenda item you're going to speak under. If it's the 6 mandated areas, you'll mention that it's that agenda item. If it's the theme for that year, you'll mention that agenda item. But we have to look at the agenda for the permanent forum and see which agenda items are open for interventions, because there's some sessions that are not open for intervention. So we're only allowed to have interventions in sessions that are open for interventions. So you'll mention the relevant agenda item that you're speaking to, and then then we have the body of the statement. What are the issues that you want to highlight? So you will mention what the issue is. You can mention the country. Sometimes, let's say if there's a cross-cutting issue, let's say violence against women, and it's a cross-cutting issue across all the countries or across all the organizations that you have, then you can say, the indigenous women of of Kenya, Tanzania, Egypt, the United States, Peru, whichever, you'll say that the women of these countries have been facing, violence, and so you can elaborate on what the issue is. But please remember, you have to be very specific to what the issue is, because there isn't enough time for you to go on and on about what the issue is. Because remember, we only have 2 or 3 minutes to give this to give the entire statement, and then you have to give concrete recommendations on what you want done. In the presentation today, Diego mentioned that the permanent forum, at the permanent forum, you can give recommendations to the UN bodies as well. So, for instance, you can call on UNICEF to do something. You can call on FAO to do something. You can call on the World Bank, if you like, whoever is relevant to your issue. You can call upon them to you can have a call to action or a recommendation for a specific UN body, if you like, or you can you can give a recommendation to the permanent forum, who will then elevate it to the ECOSOC, and then this could reach other bodies from there. And then also remember that during some of the recommendations that you give at the permanent forum can inspire a country visit, or can inspire a study by either the MBRIP or the special rapporteur, or sometimes even the permanent forum themselves will be able to conduct a study or a country visit. So some of these recommendations can inspire that. So that's why we need that the recommendations are very specific and concrete. Another thing we need to constantly remember is that permanent forum is not a complaint mechanism. So you can't go on the floor and complain, because the complaint, in as much as everyone will hear the complaint, but you must have a recommendation. Yes, this is the complaint we have, but what is the recommendation that you have that you want to address the complaint that you have? So you can't come and say, my government has done this, they've done this, they've done this, they've done this has happened in my community, and then give no recommendation. You must have a recommendation that goes hand in hand with the issue that you have, so that the recommendation can be put in record, that this is the issue and this is the recommendation that was given. So what will happen is that when we do this statement, again, it's going to be a global statement, and so it's going to be collective. So we need to be very strategic in how we present the statement, and also support the global statement with all our the organizations that we are representing, so that it's even stronger. Because many times what will happen is that group statements or group recommendations are taken up more than individual, because that statement has a collective voice. Now, in as much as I've talked about the structure being mentioning your issue and then giving the recommendation, sometimes what happens is the reverse will happen. People will give the recommendation first, then go to the issue. Why do they do this? Because they don't want to be cut off. Because when your 2 minutes are off, your mic will be switched off. Like it will automatically go off. They will not give you not 1 minute, not 1 second more. So when let's say we've prepared a statement that is 3 minutes, on the day of the presentation, we realize that the statement is only 2 minutes. That means you have to drastically change the amount of time you have to do the presentation. And so if you don't have enough time to go through the entire statement, what you will do is that you will give your recommendations first, then go to the issues. So as we do the statement, let's have that in mind. Let's have in mind that there is that we could have either 2 minutes or 3 minutes, and think about that when you're structuring your statement as well, so that you can decide whether you want to do your recommendations first, then do your issues after that. That's fine. And this goes also for the global statement. Whoever goes, whoever I mean whoever one whoever is going to be in the committee for the global statement, you can decide whether you want to have the recommendations and the issues, or the issues and then the recommendation, keeping in mind about the time constraints that we have. I've seen Joy has put the theme for this year and the 6 mandated areas on the chat. She's also put a link on the permanent forum sessions where you can see there's a lot of information on that page, where you can see the different recommendations that have been put. You can look at information on what the forum does, so that you're also aware, just in case, sometimes we need extra information or extra material to read upon. So that page that Joy has just shared is going to give you more information on the structure or the workings of the permanent forum, and you can look at them. You can look at, especially now, the 6 mandated areas, because those are the 6 things that are always there during the forum. They never change: economic and social development, culture, environment, education, health, and human rights. And sometimes what will happen is you will see that the the topic or the special theme for that year will always fall under the 6 mandated areas. So you can, because if we're talking about climate change, for instance, that falls under the environment. It can fall under health, because sometimes if climate change is affecting someone's health, then you can talk about it in health. It can be about human rights, depending on the approach that you're taking. And so those are the things we're going to look at. And unfortunately, looking at the time, and we hoped that we would be able to go into groups, but this might not be able to happen. And so, Joy, I don't know, can we take a few questions? If anyone needs some clarifications, and then we can, I think by today we can start with the Google Doc. And I think if the regions would like to meet separately, it's also a possibility, depending on how the agreement is within the region. And so I don't know if anyone has any questions or wants or needs a clarification on something. Or Joy, Orte, if there's something you have forgotten to add that you'd like to add.
Anything from Sister Orte?
Bueno, para, para terminar los minutos que
Okay,
nos...
to conclude with just the minutes that we have, I think that the exercise of writing a statement, I think that we just have to know clearly our realities and the situations that Indigenous people face in each region. Sometimes we'd like to prioritize, like we do in what's happening in our country, but we have to remember that it is a political exercise.
Nos decía Diego, hay que aprovechar el tiempo.
For the statements, as Diego was saying, is we need to take advantage of the time and space to be very concrete. And Joy has, today, I'm sorry, they have giving us a lot of information, are the experts and the advisors. So how do we show that respect as well? So they've always taught us to enter rooms very diplomatically with a greeting to the president of the permanent forum. So we greet, but sometimes we come in kind of coldly and straight to the point, but we need to remember to be respectful with our documents as well and show that respect with our documents as well. Then we need to have an introduction, letting them know who's writing that statement, who we are, because in the end, each region is going to include the reality. Then in the body of the statement, we'll discuss the main content. So for the Latin American region, for example, last year, we decided to go to that bank of recommendations that already exist so that we wouldn't be making new recommendations. So what we did was to link with the subject or the topic rather for the year at the permanent forum, so that it wouldn't be repetitive. So we wanted to have to be, to have some new recommendations so that we wouldn't be repeating recommendations that had already been made with just those 2 or maybe 3 minutes that they would give us. So let's try to present something new and not to complain, as it has been said, so we don't make the mistake of just complaining without recommendations. It is also necessary to be mindful of the 6 mandated areas at the permanent forum. I think that Diego gave us information that each one of us has the responsibility to use to, so we need to make sure that we stay within those areas so that we are in, so that we are cohesive and that we are coherent with the process, and so that our statement is considered, seriously considered. So each region, as we have said, will be doing those exercises over the next few days, so that March 13th, which is the deadline to have those statements ready, we can have them. That doesn't mean that we're going to run with this exercise. We need to make sure that we give good consideration to the topics that then in turn we are considered ourselves as important citizens. So these are the areas that we need to be working on and doing the work for this committee, which at the end of the day is a political committee. And we're going to, so out of all the we're going to choose 6 participants to participate in this process. What we ask for sometimes is to assume our responsibilities, because this exercise is not just to practice, put something into practice. Our goal, we have to remember, is to elevate our recommendations, our work to this high level. And that is why we want to take advantage of your leadership. And it is during this process that your leadership will be evident. So we ask that you do the work. We are not going to do that ourselves. It'll be your work as the product of the process of going through this program that we're already going through. So on Friday, we said that you already completed the first 2 weeks. We're starting the 3rd week. And we are going to need to see a lot more participation. As Diego was saying, sometimes that silence kind of tell us that did they understand or did they not understand? So we would like to hear over the next few classes and sessions that we have, we'd like to hear from FEMI. We'd like to see more participation, comments, questions, opinions, because as I've said, we have noticed that silence has been quite present during this class, during this group. So we really would like to see a lot more participation. I think that with the regional exercise that we're going to do, that's going to help us articulate a little bit more, get to know each other a little bit better, and to feel more confident and free to do that. It does not matter if we make mistakes. If we make mistakes, that's what we're here for, to learn, to grow. And part of the growth, as in all processes of growth, sometimes we fall, and what we need to do is get up and keep moving forward. And our purpose is to elevate those situations that we suffer at the local level to the global level. So we'll do it through that exercise. And I think that we should be excited about this exercise and to be willing to participate. Yes, Joy?
I'm sorry to intrude. Uh, just in the interest of time, because I can see we have just 3 more minutes, and I think I just want to mention 2 important points regarding the statements. One is, as Vinny had mentioned, we will be working in groups in our Google documents. So what we'd be doing is, one of you can create the Google Doc. Please add members of your region to your group, and also add the academic advisor. Then the academic advisor will put in the steps as a guideline in that Google document, so that you can refer to the guideline, and Winnie had mentioned the steps while you're developing the statement. So that is one. If one of you can volunteer to make the Google document at least by, say, by tomorrow, and then maybe add us, and then we will put in our guidelines in the Google document. Secondly, Winnie had mentioned that we will be having representatives from each region, right, for the global statement, to consolidate to combine all of your regional statements. So when you work on the regional statements, you can have, in your WhatsApp chats, you can nominate a person. You would whoever you would like to nominate, whoever is active in development of the regional statement, you can nominate and discuss in your WhatsApp group who you would like to nominate to the global to be part of the global statement. But please just be clear that for the regional statement, we will all have to work on it together. So there'll be no drafting committee for the regional statement, but the drafting committee will only be for the global school. So that is just what I want to say from my end. So kindly please add us for Asia. Anyone from Asia who's making the Google document. I can see Pema, she's volunteered to make the Google document for Asia. Pema, you please add Shibon as well. And of Africa sisters, please add Nicole as well. And I encourage Nicole and Shibon specifically to also, although you'll be working with Asia and Africa, but please do not hesitate to give in your inputs from your region's perspective. Over to you, Sister Orthia. Thank you so much, and I'm really sorry that I had to interrupt you.
Okay.
Yo creo que ya hemos concluido.
I think that we can conclude with that. So Winnie, thank you.
Thank you, Orse, and thank you everyone for joining the class today. Just also a kind reminder, please look at your calendars. all the time so that you can know what time the classes start and then you're able to be here on time. I know that the timing is always confusing, especially with the different time zones, but please keep looking at your calendars all the time before the days of the class so that you're able to plan accordingly. So thank you again. All three of us are available for any questions or clarifications even after this, and let's continue the discussions on WhatsApp. So have a good day or good night, and we'll speak to you soon. Bye, everyone.
Pema, just to answer your question, yes, Asia and Pacific region will be together. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.